My name is Nicole Neufeld, and it is my great honor to welcome you all to Cross-Border Dialogues this evening with Michelle Jacques and Kimberli Gant, moderated by Sally Frater. So it's wonderful to have you all here this evening, and we're really looking forward to your conversation as well. I'd like to suggest that we start our time together with a moment of reflection to contemplate the places that where we are. Though we're gathering in a way that is physically distanced, I'll invite you all to think about the land on which you and we all are living, working, and creating. So I myself am a second generation Canadian of Eastern European background, and I've been granted the privilege of living on this land and also recognize that I've been given a lot of access on this land within the social structures that exist in this place we call Canada. And so not everyone has my experience. And so I do think about land acknowledgements as an opportunity to remind myself to confront the ongoing effects of colonialism, the conflicts and violences that continue today and due to settler colonial power structures. And especially because of my role here at the Art Gallery of Guelph, to consider the way that cultural institutions are based on this history of colonial methods of representation. So it's a reminder to push back against those colonial structures underpinning our institution, the ways that we operate, and the colonial structures that impact people's everyday lives and realities. Let's also recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. And this must not be where we end the conversation. Let's all think about what we can do, what we need to do to take concrete action towards reconciliation, and doing so with intention and gratitude for the privileges that we all have for being on this land. So for myself here in Guelph, Ontario, in this place we now call Guelph, Ontario, it's on the ancestral lands of the Arawandran people and the Treaty 3 territory of the Mississaugas. Of course, there's a long and deep Indigenous history that we carry forward from the past, but that there's also many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who live here today as well. So I invite you in joining me in offering our respect for Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors, recognizing that we have much work to do to strengthen our relationships with them. And let's all offer respect for the elders of this land from wherever we might be, of the past, of the present, and the future. So, of course, you're joining us this evening for Cross-Border Dialogues. This is a series of conversations with speakers who work in the cultural sector from either side of the border here on Turtle Island, working in Canada and the United States, addressing a range of topics, including philosophies that inform their work, methods of engagement, and the role of education and community outreach in their practices. This program is presented by the Art Gallery of Guelph with the support of the Canada Council for the Arts through the Sector Innovation Grant, the Sector Innovation and Development Program, and also with the support of the Guelph Community Foundation. This has been the brainchild and organization of Sally Frater, who, as she started embarking on this project, was at the Art Gallery of Guelph, and she has now moved on. I had the great honor and joy of working with her as she started to think about how she might bring folks together for conversation and invite us all to join and have a little window into the discussions that these folks are having. So I'll introduce Sally and let Sally go on to introduce our speakers this evening. Sally Frater is the daughter of immigrants from the Caribbean. Curatorially, she is interested in decolonial praxis, space and place, Black and Caribbean diasporas, photography, art of the everyday, and issues of equity and representation in museological spaces. She has curated solo and group exhibitions for institutions such as the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Art Gallery of Guelph, the Ulrich Museum of Art, the Glassell School of Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Justina M. Barnaky Gallery at the University of Toronto, Project Row Houses, and Center 3 for Artistic and Social Practice. She is now the Senior Curator and Curatorial Manager at the Remy Modern in Saskatoon. I'll turn it over to you, Sally.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you to everyone who is joining us this evening. I am joining from Treaty 6 territory, and I am looking forward to speaking with tonight's curatorial colleagues. They're two very accomplished curators who I've had the pleasure for knowing for quite some time. Kimberli Gant is the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. She previously was the McKinnon Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, and has worked as the Mellon Doctoral Fellow at the Newark Museum and Director of Exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art, MOCADA. She has curated numerous exhibitions and gallery reinstallations, including Spike Lee Creative Sources from 2023, Giants, Art from the Dean Collection of Swiss Beads and Alicia Keys in 2024, Black Orpheus, Jacob Lawrence, and the Mbari Club in 2022, Journeys Across the Border, US and Mexico, Tuan Andrew Nguyen, The Boat People, 2021, Brendan Fernandez, Bodily Forms, 2020, and Jana Compra, Tropicos in 2019. Gant received her PhD in art history from the University of Texas, Austin in 2017, and holds both an MA and BA in art history from Columbia University and from 2009 in Pitzer College in 2002. Gant has published scholarly work in academic books such as Anywhere But Here, Black Intellectuals in the Atlantic World and Beyond from 2015, art publications such as NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, Art Lies, and African Arts, and exhibition catalogs for the Chrysler Museum, the Newark Museum, the Contemporary Austin, the Studio Museum of Harlem, MOCADA, Paris Photo, and the Center for Contemporary Art, Lagos. Michelle Jacques is a curator and writer who specializes in Canadian art of the 20th and 21st centuries. Since 2021, she has been the Director of Exhibitions and Collections and the Chief Curator at Remy Modern in Saskatoon. She began her curatorial career at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where she held various positions in the contemporary and Canadian art departments before departing to become the Chief Curator at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in 2012. Her recent curatorial projects include Denise Tomassos' Just Beyond, co-curated with Renee van der Everd and Sally Frater, that's me, that opened at the AGO, and it was a co-presentation between the AGO and the Remy Modern from 2022 to 2023 and is traveling. And Ken Lum, Death and Furniture, co-curator with Yuan Lund, from that, which was also a co-presentation between Remy Modern and the AGO in 2022. Over the course of her career, she has curated and written about the work of numerous contemporary artists, and she maintains a strong research interest in Canadian modernism, cultivated during her graduate studies. In 2022, Jacques was the recipient of the Hinachon Foundation Award in Curatorial Excellence, and she is currently president of the board of the AAMC Foundation, a New York-based organization that supports and promotes the work of art curators around the world. And as of yesterday, Michelle can also be counted among the recently announced 2024 Governor General Awards winners. She has been recognized with the Outstanding Contribution Award. So thank you both for joining us this evening. All right.
Yay, we sound so amazing. Yeah.
We are trying to be professional here. All right. Um, so I'm going to start out with a softball, but I think it's a really important question. I recently was reading a profile of Thelma Golden that ran in the New Yorker, and she talked about her early introduction to museums. And that's a question that I'm always curious about with artists and curators. So I'm going to put it to you. Like, what was your introduction to galleries and museums? Like, did your families regularly visit them? Um, did you have like an older relative or mentor who took you to them?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay. Um, I did not grow up in a household where we spent a lot of time at museums. We didn't spend any time at museums at all. My parents were um, really into music, and I'd have to go to every concert that the Toronto Symphony played. My mother would get us season tickets, and my father, who died a couple of years ago, like sort of in his last years of life, would express his regret that I didn't continue to pursue music. I played the oboe. Um, I can't believe that he actually thought that he was going to end up with a professional oboe player. Um, but when I was in high school, uh, my high school art class was taken to see the uh, Van Gogh show at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I liked the exhibition well enough, but what I really liked was this big institution um, right in the middle of Chinatown and beyond that, downtown Toronto. I was from the suburbs. And although I didn't actually continue to study to take art classes in high school after that year, I think that was grade 10. Um, that experience really stuck with me. And it was a kind of latent sticking with me because I went to high school at the time where if a girl showed any facility for math and science, you got pushed in that direction. So when I went to university, I started out as a biochemistry major. Um, but I was kind of miserable in that sector. It was very competitive. You didn't have an opportunity to take many electives. It was so science focused. And to cut this story a little bit short, I had a friend whose father was an engineering prof and a guidance counselor at Queen's University, where I went. And my friend suggested that I speak to his dad. And unbeknownst to me, his dad also taught the materials class in the art conservation program at Queen's. And he was a very good guidance counselor who, just kept asking questions, trying to get at the heart of what my interests were. Because the complaint that I made to him was that, at the age of 20, I was in a complete panic about how I was going to find a career that I would be willing to go to every day. So he realized that he needed to help me understand what my passion and interest was, and somehow that trip to the Art Gallery of Ontario emerged as a really not so much a formative experience, but an experience of a space and a kind of surrounding and atmosphere that I had felt oddly comfortable in, even though it was my first time. And in that conversation, he helped me decide that what I wanted to do was work in a museum. It was several years before that came into focus as a curatorial pursuit. But maybe I'll stop the story there because I'd love to hear Kim's story.
Thank you. I'm excited to be chatting with you guys both this evening. I love you both. So I had the opposite experience. I grew up in a family that was very interested in arts. My dad is creative. I like to think that I kind of had a lot of left and right brain exposure as a young person. So I really think that my interest in art really kind of came a bit through osmosis. I also, interesting enough, Michelle, applied for college as a double major in English and chemistry. And somehow they let me in. I took my first chemistry class and I was like, oh, this is awful. This is a 6-hour nightmare. But I grew up going to museums, and we went to art studios, and my parents, we had art in our home. And it wasn't anything that I was surprised by. I saw image, we had, I always like to tell the story that I remember, and my sister has it, my parents went to see Faith Ringgold's Tar Beach, the actual images and the quilt stories. So a lot of her quilt poems, if for those that don't know. And they had that, and they had a poster that they saw of her piece, Summer Picnic, which was another quilt story. And so I grew up with those posters for those exhibitions at home. And I remember the first time, not that long ago, maybe about 10 years ago, going to the High Museum and actually seeing the original quilt by Faith Ringgold and taking a picture of it and going like, oh my God, Mom and Dad, I see, like, this was, so I always use that as a story to kind of say that how we get introduced to art can be such seemingly mundane things, but the idea of having those images of Black people in my home. I mean, I went to museums and galleries kicking and screaming as a kid, but then basically stole my freshman college year roommate's life and went into an art history major and worked in museums. And that's what she did. And then she left and I wound up doing it. But I don't know how it was for you, Michelle. And also interesting, also Sally, I remember when I told my parents I was going to be an art history major, which did not go over well with them. That wasn't a real job, working in museums at the time. This is, the early 2000s. So I had to wind up minoring in econ because we didn't have a marketing degree. And that just kind of got my parents off my back. But it was a way, to them, it was really funny. They said that we introduced you to the arts because, well, we wanted to see if you had any talent. You don't. And secondly, we wanted you, because my mom was a teacher, my dad worked in corporate, and they wanted me to be able to engage in environments with culturally kind of rounded people and be able to feel comfortable, able to have conversations and feel as though I could be seen within those environments. So they were like, that's why we introduced you to this, to the world, but not that you would actually work in it. But ultimately, once I was able to have a paying career, they were fine. So
That's
I'm curious, like, about you guys, how your parents felt.
that it's really funny, the majors that you moved around in, because after I decided to drop out of biochemistry, which my parents saw as a road to medical school, I said, what I really want to do is commerce. And they lost their minds. I don't know if they were like secret communists or what was going on, but they were not happy about that. So that when I came around to art history as the thing, they were okay. I don't know that they believed that I would actually find work, but because I had positioned the decision from the decision that I wanted this path to working in a museum, at least they thought I had direction. So they were good with that. And I guess I should also mention I skipped this part of the narrative, which is that once I moved into art history at Queen's, then I had access to the Agnes Etherington Art Center, and I just wanted to give a shout out for the importance of university art galleries.
True, true. Very good. Very true.
So from this, I'm going to jump to the next question. And I think it's interesting in light of what you have both shared about your sort of entry into the study of art. Do you recall when you became aware of what curating was and what prompted you to become a curator?
I can start. I became aware of it more in college as a kind of a job. I became aware of like art history as just kind of a field and a discipline in high school, only through kind of advanced placement courses. But and I think I kind of learned about it when I realized, okay, I'm going to major in this thing and I've got to convince my parents that it's not a bad decision. So I kind of, Google, Yahoo, whatever search engine I kind of went through and just like jobs with art history degree. Like I kind of like looked it up and said, oh, right. So these shows I would go see with my parents, like a person does that. And then I kind of just got really interested in kind of learning about it and kind of how does one do that? How does one become this and work in it? And so with that, I also, to Michelle's point, at Pitzer College, where I did my undergrad, it's part of 5 colleges kind of on the same 500 colleges, we're all kind of on the same campus. So I volunteered at what was then the Pomona College Museum of Art, and talked to my professors and kind of talked about like, how does one be a curator? And luckily I had a professor maybe my junior year that in art history classes, we actually had to not only go see shows, but propose how we would do a show. So I got some initial exposure, and I did, summer internships being from Chicago. I did one summer after my sophomore year at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and, was able to kind of just really reaffirm that's what I wanted to do. So.
Well, another layer to my story of moving from biochemistry to art history is that in speaking to the professor guidance counselor who taught art conservation, he really thought that a good path could be taking that experience in biochem and seriously thinking about art conservation. And at the time, I think my personality was such that sitting in a lab with just works of art sounded very appealing to me. So I studied art history for enough years to get a double major. And then, because I had this experience of going to the Art Gallery of Ontario in my mind, when I finished school and had to get a job, I dropped off a resume at the AGO, and of course I was, a 22 or 23-year-old person with a art history BA. So I don't know what kind of job I thought I was going to get, but remarkably, I did get a job as the membership coordinator in the development department. So for quite a few years, I I worked first in membership and then as administrative support for the volunteer committee at the AGO. And remarkably, there is somebody here tonight who I met when I worked in those departments in the early years. Hi, Kay. And it really was when I was on the job working these kind of foot in the door positions at the AGO that I finally learned what a curator was. It was, not the fast road to becoming a curator, to sort of enter the museum field with no real practical training or even understanding of the kind of more intellectual work that happens in a museum. But it was a really interesting way to get a taste of everything that happens in a large museum. And I decided to do an MA after working at the AGO for a couple of years, and I decided against art conservation and went into art history. And I can remember like being at a development event and meeting the chief curator of the AGO, Roald Nasgard, at that event for the first time, even though we had worked in the same building for a number of years. It's a huge museum and not everybody's paths cross, and I was the membership coordinator. But we had a conversation at that event where he basically asked me who I was and what I did, and I asked him who he was and what he did. And so I headed off to graduate school with Roald Nasgard's description of his job in my head, and now I have the same job that he had at that time.
Kimberli, do you remember well, obviously you remember, but can you please speak to us about your first job working in a museum? Michelle touched on that, and also what you decided to focus on when you did your MA.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. So my first official job was working at Mokata. But after I finished graduating from my undergrad, I left. So I was in California, I moved back to Chicago, and then I was living in New York. And so I was working in kind of an advertising marketing jobs because I had applied for fellowships at the Met. Interviews, didn't wind up getting it, but I was still really excited about institutions. So what I did was I would go to my kind of regular marketing job, but I knew some galleries that had started off in Chicago and had opened some other spaces in New York. So I'd actually go on, because I knew them, I would go on their openings and kind of bartend, like, so just like opening the wine bottles and like talking to people, just so I could feel like I was in the arts world then. And then I had heard about Mokata. The space was just opening. It is for those of you that don't know, it is a very small kind of Kunsthalle institution. It doesn't have a permanent collection in Brooklyn, and was actually the outgrowth of my then boss's master's thesis. And so was moving into a new building. And I basically spent 6 months trying to get a job interview. Because I had this corporate experience, I came with like my resume and everything, and she had an opportunity, and I was like, I'll take it. And so wound up working there for 5 years. And I think similar kind of, similar Michelle said, it was a staff of 2 initially. It was me and my boss. So at one point I had, I think, about 5 different business cards, depending on who I was meeting or chatting with that day. Which I honestly felt, now looking back on it, was some of the best experience I ever got, because I had to learn how to do everything. And it really was trial by fire. I started, and we had just gotten a grant from the New York State Council for the Arts on doing a small show. My boss said, curate a show. And I'd never curated anything before. I was like, how does one do this? You don't get taught this in art history classes. But because I had been going to shows, I actually I would try and find email addresses of the curators whose shows I liked. And I would actually kind of just cold email them and just say, hey, I'm like this young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed curator who doesn't really know what that means, and I have to do this job, and can someone give me some guidance? And a few people did. Most didn't respond. I kind of got ghosted, but I had a few that did, and I was able to have coffee with them and chat about what being a curator meant, how to actually organize a show, how does one go about doing that? And still friends with them that day. So I always like to tell students to, there's great, and I'm like, I think the AGO is an incredible institution, and I love the bigger museums, but I also think, the smaller places too, you can get so much more experience, like practical experience oftentimes, I think. And so I think those are just really great organizations to make sure you have experience in, because you can get a lot more kind of like a holistic exposure to the museum field.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, was there anything that surprised you when you first started curating? Particularly because of, as you mentioned, you don't necessarily get training on that. At least you didn't when I did my master's, or when there was a program that you could take that was like focused on gallery and museums when I was an undergrad, but I didn't take that class. And but anyways, you said, was there anything that, or as I was posing or positing the question, was there anything that surprised you when you first started to do this work?
I think for me, and then I'll Michelle, please answer too. How similar to corporate work it was without it being it. So that's very vague. So basically, it's still very much just like a job. I was still having to email, I was still having to do reports, I was still having to kind of look at trends and do research. Like it was different information I was consuming and trying to understand. And it was great in terms of getting to travel a little bit and getting to meet artists. But in terms of the day-to-day, a museum is a business, and you have to treat it in that way. It just has a different tax structure. So I think that to me was probably at least in the US. So that was the most, I think, surprising thing for me.
I'm glad I let you go first, because that answer has shifted my thinking about how to answer. It makes me think of an anecdote, and I'm really going to show my age here. It was interesting to hear you, Kimberly, talk about emailing people, curators who you admired, to set up meetings. And I was working at the AGO when we got an internal email system, and it was still like several years before anybody outside of the institution had an email address for me to email. But I can also recall I was still a curatorial assistant. And, the one thing that I will say about my experience at the AGO, given how long ago it was before I don't know. I don't even know what happened, why so many Canadian museums are no longer structured like this. But I started as a research assistant, and then I moved on to curatorial assistant, and then assistant curator, associate curator. And from inhabiting all of those roles, I was able to really benefit from on-the-job training and always having the mentorship of the people who were above me in that structure. But even as a curatorial assistant, I can recall going on vacation with a friend of mine who was a resident at a hospital. She had recently, finished medical school. And we were going to Europe together. And this is where it shows my age. It was in the days when you had a telephone in the back of the seat in front of you on the plane. And that was how you could, um, uh, keep contact with the world below. And I was on that phone, like, for until the plane took off, trying to put out fires back at the museum as I was on my way to my vacation. And my friend, the doctor, was like, "What? I'm on vacation. There's somebody else looking after the patients." There's never anybody else looking after the patients in the museum world, it seems. And I think that was my biggest surprise, is how fast paced it is, how much you have to multitask, how much you have responsibility for, and how it really was not that idyllic, quiet space that I envisioned when I told the guidance counselor I wanted to work in a museum.
So you've touched on, well, was sort of like the veil was lifted for you in terms of all of the different components of the work, that it wasn't necessarily this space of repose. Were there challenges that you first encountered when you were doing this work that perhaps you weren't necessarily prepared for?
A lot, yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Kimberli?
No, I mean, I just think to what Michelle said, I mean, the pace, I mean, I think it was different for me in the sense of, because it was such a small staff,
Mhm.
that again, a lot of it was trial by fire. So I didn't have I had a boss who was able to give me certain mentorship tips, but there was a lot of things that I just had to kind of go out and find out on my own, which I think was very beneficial for me, because you know, I have my dad worked in advertising for a long time, and I would always kind of see him, and he was like the guy, he was out, he was talking to people, very gregarious, networking. So I saw that. So I was able to kind of fake it, in the sense of I would be very nervous about talking with people at the very beginning, but I knew I had to do it. Like, I knew the importance of networking. And so I had to kind of just get over, to a certain extent, of just being able to go, I need to get this done. So I got to figure out the way to get it done. Because this grant is due, or this project has to happen. So, and this is your job, like, get it done. So I think it's very different when you, I think also, so to summarize, how the size of an institution and who you have to work with can drastically shift, I think, how you learn how to do what you do, and how to be the type of curator maybe that you want to be. When you have much more strict silos, to when you're just like, I know what this job is, so I already know how to anticipate what that person needs to be effective for me. To get my job done, I can help them get theirs.
Yeah.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that I could talk for the next couple of hours about the challenges that surprised me, but a couple of things that I think I will flag. One is that, to the question of mentorship, everybody was flying by the seat of their pants. So often what I acknowledge as really important mentorship was somebody saying something as they were running by me and probably having no idea how important what they had said was to the way I thought about my work. But I can remember a colleague, Christina Ritchie, telling me that as a curator in a big institution, it was my job to protect the artist from the institution. And there were many times when that was so evident, and it's not, something totally nefarious. It's just that in a institution where there's a staff of 500 or 700 people like working there are needs that often can completely overshadow the needs of the artist. So that was kind of when I moved to a much smaller institution and could see how in a space where you had a staff of 22 people, everybody could be working together towards the goal of creating the exhibition, supporting the artist's work, bringing the artist and the audience together. I finally understood how in a huge institution, not everybody is close enough to the core work of, or what we see as the core work of exhibition making, to be prioritizing needs in the same way you do as a curator. And then the other thing that was always a challenge was representing the institution to the arts community, to the community of artists, the local community of artists, and trying to do what I could to bring balance to that relationship, because to go back to Kimberli's observation that a museum is a business, an art gallery is a business, being a successful business didn't always align with what the arts community, the artists community thought the museum should be doing with them.
Beautifully said, Michelle.
So I'm going to pick up on some of the threads that you just mentioned in this last response. So one of the things that didn't occur to me until I was kind of going over your CV last night, I always knew that you kind of shifted back and forth between contemporary, being a curator of contemporary art and a curator of Canadian art at the AGO. And for the first time, I actually noticed how it occurred to me that your presence in that role might be incongruous for some people. And I'm going to bear that in mind. But the other thing was, for a long time, I think that you were the only, you weren't the only Black curator, but you were the only Black curator at a major institution in the country. And I'm wondering if you would care to kind of walk us through what that experience was like, because I'm sure there were a lot of sort of presumptions about what it meant for you to be in that role, and also expectations from specific communities. And I'm wondering if that was something if you felt certain pressures from that, or if it was something that you couldn't necessarily be like overly cognizant of at that time, while you were moving forward with the work that you were doing. I've awkwardly phrased that question.
Right. It's a very layered question. And yeah, I have never held a role that has come with the expectations that I curate Black artists, or racialized artists. And in fact, when I first got a job in the curatorial department at the AGO, and I forgot a step. One of my stepping stones was that I was a curatorial secretary. I can't believe they actually called the role that, but I remember being told that I had gotten the job because I had just finished my MA, and it was at a time when museums, mainstream museums, were sort of grappling with the expectation that they be thinking about feminism and issues of race, and like, you know, post-colonial theory was all the rage in the mid 90s. So I had not studied curating, but I had studied art history at York University with a kind of leaning towards that kind of content. So that's why I got the job. And apparently, and then I worked for many, many years writing acquisition rationales and curating permanent collection installations that really didn't allow me to even think about those kind of socio-political issues, or think about how to shake up what was being presented in the museum. I became a very capable curator of Euro-Canadian art. And I think ultimately, and I think I saw a question in the chat about who I studied with at Queen's, and I studied with guys in tweed suits. It was a very, very traditional training. And I think ultimately that kind of mainstream art history training, coupled with what I did in graduate school, and what I've learned on the job, has allowed me to kind of emerge as a curator who balances an interest in the art of racialized artists and, you know, everything else as well. So to get back to the other part of the question, which I think is about how my community, if we consider the Black Canadian artists community as my community, responded to me being in the institution, but not really having the authority or even direction to work with Black artists. Like, I think that was, you know, you've really come to the heart of what I was trying to speak about in a more vague way about the tensions between the arts community and the institution. And I think, you know, looking back, that was one of the most difficult aspects of being a curator at the AGO, not being able to represent my community in deep and meaningful ways. So now, all of these years later, being able to do things like the Denise Tomasa show with you are, it's kind of like me making up for lost time or something.
Yeah. So Kimberli, I think you've had very different experiences working in the States. But I'm wondering if maybe the kinds of expectations that Michelle has alluded to perhaps came from staff within the museum, or perhaps there were other sorts of expectations that you had to respond to, just in terms of artists, the way I think there's this thing with every single gallery and every single museum has to deal with this, or I shouldn't say that in those kinds of terms. Basically, there are expectations that artists and arts communities might have, and sometimes it's not as easy, or sometimes those expectations aren't as easily met when you're working within the institution. Am I being too obtuse here?
I think it goes to kind of what Michelle said. There's a tension between what artists, the arts community, especially if you're a curator of color, what those communities expect of the curator of color in an institution where where you're one of maybe a few, if not the only. You know, I've been able to kind of have different situations that have let me experience different things. You know, working at Mokata, it was basically an all Black staff and all brown staff. So the expectations on us were different. We were this small new institution that was really focused on local artists and I was also trying to bring in some international artists. We were just trying to do, you know, kind of a scrappy small organization, just trying to do some cool shows and bringing people in. As opposed to working at a place like Newark or the Chrysler Museum, which are more mid-sized institutions. In both instances, I was like the only Black curator. The first time I was a fellow, so I didn't have, you know, I was a full-time staff, but I was a contracted staff. So that allowed me to actually have a bit more flexibility because they knew I was only there for like a, you know, certain amount of time. So I was able to actually make relationships and bring in some acquisitions. I also definitely want to credit the fact that I had some great professional mentorship of like of all you know, of different types of individuals, and just kind of literally learning from them. And I think what's also been great for me is that I've worked in different parts of the country. So I've also had to learn the expectations of that particular region and local area, because there's different communities have different understandings of what good art is, what they want to see. And so you have to navigate that too, just what the expectation of what they want to see. So, which I think has just been great, fruitful. Like it all adds to those layers of just knowledge and experience and going, okay. And honestly, you know, having to code switch, we do that all the time. And how I'm presenting myself to a very wealthy patron, potential donor, as opposed to an artist I'm trying to cultivate, is very different many times. I mean, I still think I'm myself, but just even my language or just how I'm acting is all a part of those expectations of you. And you have to really learn how to navigate that while still being at least true to yourself, still feeling as if I am still me. I'm just I'm a variation on a theme, I guess. Same theme, but just a slightly different tone. And as I've gotten older, I've also tried to be very clear with the institutions that I've worked at, because I also think that there's this idea that once you get into the job, you're like, great, I'm here, I'm doing it, this is it. But then there's the reality of it. There's the reality of you've got a seat at the table, but not everyone at the table necessarily wants you there or wants your ideas there. So how am I gonna make sure you guys see that I'm still doing good work? And also that I know how to engage with all of these different audiences in some way. Not perfectly, but.
So I'm wondering, and you both have touched on this somewhat. So as curators, what do you feel that your responsibilities are to communities, and how do you facilitate community engagement? And then I'm going to jump in with my second part of the question. I'm also wondering what community engagement looks like within curatorial communities. And I know that you're both going to touch on this, like the sense of responsibility that you might feel to publics or audiences and the communities within those groups. Does that also extend to your network of peers?
I'm going to answer that question with some ideas that popped into my head in response to the final thing that Kimberly said. And I just wanted to articulate this because I feel like all of a sudden it's occurred to me that back in the early days of my career, like part of the pressure of not curate racialized artists had to do with assumptions about who the audience was and what the audience wanted. So one thing that I'm very happy about, and I don't know why I haven't even really thought this through, because it seems like such an important and obvious thing, is that like we're at least at a point now where we recognize that you're not programming to the demographics of where you are, and that of course just as we attend exhibitions of the work of white artists and enjoy them, white audiences enjoy the exhibitions of Black and other racialized artists. And like working at Ramey Modern, that's so obvious, and it's not even something that we talk about. Like if we present this show, is the sort of are the communities of Saskatoon going to enjoy Denise Tomasis? She's a Black or a Trinidadian Canadian artist who worked in the States. What is the relevance? But those were questions that really sort of permeated decision making, not that not that long ago. So in many ways, I am grateful to audiences, to communities who come to museums for the role that they've played in being receptive to the work of artists who are different, who have different experiences, lived experiences, cultural backgrounds to them, because that's actually made it easier for me to put certain projects on the table. And Kimberli, you were talking about moving from place to place, from region to region, and having to understand what the audiences in those new places would be receptive to. And I've had a similar kind of moving around. I've been talking a lot about working at the Art Gallery of Ontario, but I've also worked in Halifax and Victoria, BC, and now in Saskatoon. And those are three places where the community that you're speaking to is almost much more palpable, because you're not in a big city of millions and millions of people. Like, you know, most of the people who are coming to your institution when you work in a smaller place like that. And this is a sort of anecdotal response to who the community is and how you speak to them and how you engage with them. But when I got to the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, Victoria was the place where Emily Carr, renowned Canadian painter of forests and trees and totem poles, was born and lived most of her life, and where she died. And it's a bit of a mecca for people who love Emily Carr, and everybody who lives in Victoria is very proud of her. And when I would, sort of survey local people when I first got there about what they wanted to see at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, they would all say Emily Carr. And I would be like, I can't just do Emily Carr shows. And I would try and dig into it with them. What is it that they really mean when they say they want Emily Carr? And through conversation, I determined that what they meant was they wanted something that was really locally relevant, that they could be proud of, that was an interesting story. And we just sort of worked from that. And I think before too long proved that it wasn't just Emily Carr that people wanted, but these points of connection to the place that they lived and its art history. And that was a really important learning experience for me, because, as long as we studied art history, we don't know all of the artists. And many people don't have a lot of experience of art history or even the contemporary art being made around them. So things that are recognizable are attractive, and part of our job, of course, is opening up that field of understanding and recognition. And that was a really important lesson for me, about sort of digging into the why and not focusing just on the who.
Kimberli, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, a little bit. I was trying to think.
So basically the question was just about like, as a curator, how do you feel that what do you feel your responsibilities are to communities, and whether that is like publics or audiences, certain demographics and also within curatorial communities too.
Sure. So I like to say that my responsibility as a curator is both to listen. I mean, I think that's the first thing, like you want to listen to what communities want, but I think as Michelle very, nicely said, you also want to push them a bit. They may say one thing, but there's something deeper than, okay, we want to see this artist again and again. It's more about, no, the proudness of local art histories and knowing that there is a legacy there, but also I think, I want people to also see the world as bigger than perhaps what they know it to be. So when I was at the Chrysler, I definitely, and I was able to, and this also goes to the question about the expectations of what I think people present on me. I knew that I wanted to focus more on artists of color, not exclusively Black artists, but, so I was able to bring in and present artists from Vietnam, from Singapore, Black artists, not just from the United States, but from, West Africa, and tell stories that have, and not just young artists, but artists who've been doing it for a long time, but they weren't seen really during their career, or the story, or changing that narrative. So I think that there's a way of, you want to give people what they want, but you also want to say, let me introduce you to some artists, to some stories, to some moments in time that you didn't expect, because again, to Michelle's point, they may be very excited to know about that. And you never know. I mean, you can assume or think, this audience for this show might be X, Y, and Z. And that's how you kind of help get that onto the books for the show. But at the same time, I've always been excited when I see a show and go like, oh my God, I never knew this artist existed. And I'm sad I didn't know, but now that I do know, I want to know more. So I feel as if I want to know more, other people will also want to know more. And I think finally, I want to present art to people that makes them stop and look. They don't have to like it. They can dislike it. And I'm fine with that, but I at least want them to not be passive as they're going through, and just I mean, we've all been to shows, we kind of walk through and you leave and you don't really remember what you saw, or you kind of go through and just go like, it was okay, I didn't really feel anything for it, as opposed to those shows that you just go, that was awful, I don't want to see it again, or as opposed to like, I loved it, I want more and more and more. And so that to me is, I think, a goal of, to me as a good curator, is to be able to give people an experience, a moment in time that they will remember for whatever reason. So yeah, I think that's, yeah.
I think that's a really kind of succinct way of terming what it is that I think many curators are hoping to achieve, the kind of effects or experiences we're hoping to have with audiences. What are some of the key ways that your understanding of curating has shifted over time?
I can say two things. I think one way it's shifted is, well, it's more because I'm in a situation now where, so there's the luxury of time, and it's not really a question of how it's shifted, but it is something that, as I get more in this career and work in different museums, the importance of that, the importance of being able to have the time and the resources to bring about scholarship that you feel is really contributing to the field, is really telling some stories that haven't been told and telling them in impactful ways. And that is what I want to do. But at the same time, we often do not get that luxury. It is rare when we have that opportunity. So how can I still do impactful work on a much more limited timeline and funds? And I think you can definitely do that. You know, in Presenting Giants, I did not have and Spike Lee, working on both those shows together, I did not have the time that I would have wished for necessarily, but I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of the team and what we were able to accomplish with those projects. And, you know, people may feel certain ways about it because it's private collections, and they're more, it's very populist, in that sense. But I do think it's telling stories that are new for certain people. The idea of looking at the mind of a director and the creative inspirations of that individual, and then collectors who are really trying to believe in the artists and what they're collecting. And so hopefully using those as examples of how people can see the importance and value of art. Because I think the pandemic reminded us the incredible critical value of creativity. And yet museums are still very thought of as elitist organizations, and audiences are changing. You have to adapt to that, and we need people to still see their importance. And so we need to kind of think about how we're going to continue that now and into the future.
I should just let that answer sit because it was such a good answer. But I feel obliged to say something. So maybe what I will add, and I'm not sure how, maybe at the root of what I'm saying is an idea that's very similar to Kim's observations on the question. But I've realized that, like, when I started my curatorial career in a large institution, there was quite a bit of tension between the curatorial department and other departments in the institution. You didn't necessarily work happily with the education department. You didn't necessarily work happily with the design department. And I feel like I've done a couple of projects recently where everything was really integrated, and the results were so, like, perfect. So I think that the short answer for me is that my understanding of curating has changed, so that I see its edges as very blurry now. And as a result, less and less, I'm doing scholarly research and building an exhibition out of sort of deep knowledge. More and more, I feel like I'm working with others to shape something. And I guess I'm going to stop feeling so guilty about not doing better research, because maybe I've just convinced myself that I was trying to break down silos all along. So maybe I'm in a good place.
I'm going to skip ahead a bit in the interest of time because there are some questions in the Q&A. So what advice do you have for younger people wishing to enter the profession?
You want to go first, Michelle?
Sure. There are so many ways to answer that question, and there are so many ways that I have answered that question over the years, and sometimes my answer is very practical. You know, do a curatorial program or residency or something that allows you to start getting projects under your belt, is a very practical observation. Another piece of advice that I often give is that, you know, it's much easier to engage people in conversations about your ideas. And once you get people excited about your ideas, then you can pitch projects and they're not going to be able to say no because you've gotten them so excited about the idea. But yesterday I was asked a similar question, and what I really leaned into as the answer was the importance of building relationships with other curators, with artists, with arts interested supporters, and really it's that network. And I'm reluctant to use the word because it sounds like I mean this in a strategic way, and that's not what I mean. But it's that community of all of the players of the art world around you that will sustain your career, give you escape when your job is driving you crazy, but allow you to escape to a place that reminds you why you do what you do, why you work where you work. And yeah, like yesterday with the announcement of the Governor General's Award, I was just reminded of 30 years of relationship building in the art world. And no matter what happens from here on in, I've got that, and that is a remarkable thing. And I would encourage everybody to build up your community.
Congratulations, Michelle. I just want to say that's well deserved, because you've been doing the damn thing for a good long while, and we're seeing it, and it's overlooked to be acknowledged. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And then I'll also add, I'll also be very practical about it. I think the older that I've gotten, the more I'm so one, I think, are there ways to do what you do without incurring a lot of debt? And this, I'm saying, maybe this is maybe like a very US more specific thing, but because of just graduate school, okay, maybe not share it, salaries in your head, great. But just thinking about, you know, I'm still paying for my grad loans, and almost finished. But the fact of the matter is, are there ways in which you can curate? So I'll take a step back in that all my degrees are art history. So I went similar to Michelle, I went very traditional in that way. I thought about doing like an arts admin degree, museum studies at one point. I think curatorial studies was like kind of happening when I was looking at maybe my PhD program, but I realized again, you don't learn those skills in school. You learn those skills at work. So are there ways to do the job, learn the skills, and not incur the debt to it? I think an issue that the field is grappling with is the degreeification of everything, where, you know, the college degree is the high school degree and the master's degree is the BA degree, and like that type of thing. So thinking about it that, you know, so thinking about those things. I also definitely agree with Michelle, is really having those connections, you know, meeting with artists, like just making those relationships yourself. creating your own opportunities, I think, too. I don't think you always want to rely on feeling like you have to work at an organization to present a show. I always use the example of one of the students I was in grad school with. She was further ahead in the PhD program than I was, but she had her little apartment and she kind of created the sofa gallery. She made a little website off Wix or, one of those things, and would work with the MFA studio students and have, just a couple of pieces like above the sofa in her apartment, and like created openings every quarter. And like we all went, like, I mean, the work often would sell, not at high price points, but she was curating. I mean, she was presenting shows, dealing a little bit, and it was and it got her out there. It got her exposure, especially it was Austin in the local media at the time. So I think we're also in a moment where social media, for its, for all of its issues, is providing opportunities to put yourself out there in ways in which you couldn't in previous decades and generations, and giving you exposure. You got to be careful with it. You got to be very, very careful with it. And I think, again, remember that the art world is a business. And I think so I'll finish with two very practical things that I wish I had done. I wish I had been better, especially if you're an undergrad, taken studio classes, because I think I would be a stronger, and I'm actually starting to do this for myself, I think I would be a stronger curator if I understood better the technical aspects of art making. And so I think just the language and the technicality, the styles, all those ideas, I'm learning that more now, to just be able to have better, more fruitful conversations with artists. And two, learning really the business of art, scholarship, and this, I don't know, you don't always need this, but I just think understanding those the economics of it helps, in just having that kind of in your background. So those are the last two things I'll say.
Okay. I'm tempted to ask you more questions, but I really feel like I should turn it over to the audience. So maybe we'll leave it there. So we have questions both in the Q&A and in the chat. Let's see. Okay, so in your curatorial process, what role does imagination, risk-taking, and disrupting norms play as you curate exhibits?
I'll say that really, and sorry, go ahead,
No,
Michelle.
no, please go ahead.
It definitely is involved, but it depends on the project. Like, I mean, when Michelle was talking about, being able to kind of get buy-in from people, tell a story, to pitch a show, like there's a level of imagination and storytelling you really need to be able to do for that, to get the institutional buy-in. Risk-taking depends, because ultimately you want your institution, the institution wants media attention and they want money for the show. So there has to be a way in which the imagination and the risk-taking is still going to be rewarding for the institution, to do the project. So I think, disrupting norms and all that can be involved, but ultimately the project has to have a story that will appeal to people who will pay for the tickets, the grants who will underwrite it, and your colleagues who will be working with you to create that whole vision.
For many years when I was working at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, we were on the verge of a renovation. So I think it was probably for 4 or 5 years, we were always about to shut down the existing campus for this architectural renovation. But we had fundraising challenges. So for a lot of the time that I was working there, we were um, conceiving of projects on a really, really short timeline because the news would come that, the final funding hadn't come through. We weren't going to break ground. We needed a new roster of shows right away. And I was really sort of playing fast and loose with the collection primarily. Sometimes we would do projects with contemporary artists who were able to respond on a short timeline, but the collection shows were a little wacky, and not at all art historically grounded. And one that I will tell you about, this was organized on such a short timeline. I decided to work in the collection with artists who were from Victoria and the region, um, big group show. And I was probably writing the extended labels 2 weeks before the show was supposed to open. And that was the moment that I realized that many of these artists had never had anything published about their work, any research done. So I really didn't want to put up in a label incorrect information or things that interpreted the work in the wrong way, but that because they were on the label seemed like they were truth. So I came up with this design strategy for the labels where they looked like typewritten notes. And I would have the sort of factual information at the top in the house font. And then underneath, I used a different font, and it was sort of those other texts were my ramblings. And I made it clear that what I was writing was me sort of trying to work through what the work was about. And I thought, like, I'm going to be skewered. This is ridiculous. I've put half-baked thoughts on labels and put them up in the gallery and opened a show. And like, I have never had such good public response to an exhibition. And it was because of the sort of transparency of what curatorial thinking is. People really appreciated that. And I think conveying that it's a working through of things and not some sort of uh, ultimate knowledge that we have that we use to curate shows, really shifted people's understanding of what the curator does.
Thank you. Here's maybe a quick question. Kim, did your early experiences like travel influence your career decisions?
Some. Hey, Dad. Thanks for always supporting me. But I mean, I think, yeah, I got early exposure to being able to travel internationally. And I think at the time I wouldn't have thought it was profoundly influential, other than the fact that I could say, oh, wow, like I'm seeing other parts of the world. I remember my parents had told me, look, we want you to be able to understand what it is like to be a Black person in other parts of be outside of the United States. What does that mean? How do you move through this planet? How do other cultures connect with you, interact with you? What does it mean if you don't know the language? How do you navigate that? So I think what it's done as I've gotten older is, I don't know that it's directly impacted my job, but it's, again, just reminded me the world is so much bigger than I know. And I have these experiences where I do get to travel, and it always reminds me how little I know, and just how incredible the world is, and communities and cultures, and that there's always surprises. And if you are open to that, you will always be learning, and always just taking that learning in, and hopefully using it for fuel to just to be, you know, better person, better scholar, better human. Yeah.
Thank you. Curators do shoulder so much responsibility, and the stakes are always high. How do you maintain equilibrium, equanimity, and avoid burnout when grant cycles never cease and expectations on the part of artists, institutions, funders, publics remain as high as ever post-2020? Asking for a friend.
If I'm honest, I haven't gotten better at that as my career has unfolded. I feel like I've lost all ability to maintain balance. I hope that Kim has some good advice for me.
I don't know if I have good advice, but I mean, I think, I don't know how you feel, Michelle and Sally, but I definitely feel the older I get, the more I realize I do love my job, but it is also still a job. And I feel like I've gotten a bit better at boundaries. Not great. It's not perfect. It never will be perfect, but just hints about, you know, not responding to emails every 5 seconds, not being, you know, trying to set parameters on, okay, if I'm going to go see shows, I'm going to try and do that during the work week, and the weekends I'm going to go for walks, and I'm going to enjoy the fact that I live in New York City, and just do things that fulfill me so that I can do what I need to do in my job, and do it well. But see, you know, talking about our idea of connections, like seeing friends, trying to be better at just checking in on my community, my personal community that supports me and that I want to support them, and just saying like, hey, let's get a coffee, let's go out and just go for a walk, or you know, sometimes at lunch, like luckily our building is right by the Botanic Gardens. I go, you know, especially once it gets warm out, I'm trying to do things in the, you know, in the park if I just have to be reading. So I think it's seasons. I think it is just, we will always be busy. There's never a time we're not busy. So if you accept that, then you go, okay, so how do I prioritize my busyness so that I'm in my personal necessities also have weight? And it's not, you know, there's no direct, I don't think there's any easy way to answer that, because everyone is grappling with this. And we're all just doing the best we can. I think that's what I just tell myself, like, you're doing great. Every one of us in this room, remind yourself, if not every day, every week, you're doing great. You're doing the best you can. And even though it's silly, it sometimes really does help.
So one last question. As a racialized artist coming up in Canada, I often hear artists of many mediums expressing the need to leave Canada and then maybe come back. I guess this is more a Michelle question, but you could also weigh in too, Kimberly, in order to be successful. What are your thoughts on that in Canada's infrastructure attitude towards the arts compared to the world at large?
I think that that is an unfortunate kind of attitude of Canadian culture, not just for racialized artists. It's a thing that we've been grappling with for a long time, that we have had a little bit of an inferiority complex. Even tonight, before this conversation started, we were talking about the bad lighting in Canadian television. So that it is something that we absolutely have to shake. I have seen it all across my career, how a Canadian artist's success outside of Canada attracts attention. But just today, Sally and I and the other curators from Ramey Modern were having a day-long brainstorming session, and we were trying to look close to home to think about who is here and working that we want to work with and bring to Ramey Modern, and support through the remarkable resources and team that we have to work with here. So it's absolutely something that we have to push against, and it's sort of like a I hope you're not asking the question because you're going to do what we say, because I want to tell you to stay here and make your career in Canada, and that this is a problem that most people who work in museums and art galleries recognize and are grappling with and trying to push against, because um, uh, of course we want people to stay here, but then at the same time, we can look at a number of great successes of Canadian artists who have built remarkable careers outside of Canada, and enjoy recognition both at home and beyond because of it. So that's not an answer, but that's my analysis of the situation.
All right. Well, I think that draws us to the end of our conversation together this evening. Again, I wish to thank you both for your thoughtfulness and for your time. And I always enjoy hearing my peers speak about their work. And I'm particularly privileged to be able to, I guess, indulge myself by being in dialogue with people who are so thoughtful and take such care with the work that they do. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope that you will be able to join us again on April the 4th when we have our next conversation in the series with Tamara Toledo and Marcela Guerrero. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sally.
Thank you both. That was a great conversation.
Yes. So much brilliance.
Good
Sorry, I
night.
know this is very professional.